If you were to look at occupiers right now, I think there are three major problems. Generational issue. We've got three generations that are both look at work and define work very, very differently.
Green leases are definitely that opportunity.
Even larger companies don't have the skills, don't have the time to really do more on sustainability, despite the fact that there's increasing pressure on them to do better.
We need to think a bit more creatively and think a bit more outside of the box in terms of the space that we're in, how we effectively use that space and how we effectively price that space.
Hello and welcome to JEBCast, the podcast where we explore the future of office design, sustainability and its impact on the spaces we work. I'm your host, Andy Russell, and today we're diving into a big topic, the future of office spaces, balancing landlord strategies and occupier needs. We've seen massive shifts in how we use the office space, driven by hybrid working, ESG expectations, and changing workplace cultures. So what does that mean for landlords and occupiers? Well, to unpack it all, I'm joined by two fantastic guests today, Senior Director of Occupier Services at Colliers and Yongki Hong, Senior Portfolio Manager at Swire Properties. Before we dive in, I'd love to let our listeners get to know you both a little bit better. So Josh, let's start with you. If you could just tell us a bit about yourself, your background and your role at Colliers.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Andy. Really appreciate it. Like you said, working the occupier service is part of our business. There are two sides of that business. There's the landlord rep and the tenant rep. So I work in the tenant rep side of the business. And primarily what that means is I represent occupiers all throughout Hong Kong. And we look at their real estate portfolio and we see where we can drive value throughout that portfolio. And that can be done in a whole host of different ways. So we could look at obviously the rent and their space and whether they need to expand or contract, or we could actually look at their space and look at activating it, create areas of collaboration, etc. So a whole host of things that we look at. The landlord side of the business is actually Yongki's part of the business, and we work with Swire and other large landlords as well, and we market their properties, and we hopefully have plans that, you know, get occupiers into those buildings. But like I say, I work in the tenant rep side of the business.
Thanks, Josh. Yongki, over to you. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your role at Swire?
Yeah, of course. Also, I think a big thank you for having me as well. So yeah, my title is, I think, technically Senior Manager, Portfolio, but I work in the Taikoo Place office, which is actually just down the road from here. And I am just one member of a very large and talented team that looks after 10 buildings spanning just shy of 7 million square feet. I think Josh's work is probably a bit more specific to the commercial elements, but we look at it a bit more holistically in terms of the leasing and management. So we basically look at the whole life cycle of managing commercial assets, whether that is sourcing new tenants via agents or otherwise, agreeing, negotiating leases, managing those tenants throughout the lifetime of the lease, hopefully never losing them, but if they decide to go, managing that. And pretty much everything in between. So I'm very lucky to be part of a really great team.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So now we've got a better understanding of who you are, what you do, where you come from. Maybe we can set the scene a little bit before we go into the discussion today. The office space, the world that we live in and work in every day, has gone through a serious shakeup over the last few years. Remote, hybrid working is definitely here to stay. Economic pressures are real. And the different generations of work that we're now seeing working in tandem in the workplace have set different expectations than we've ever seen before. So the big question is, how are occupiers and landlords responding to these changes? So the changing office landscape, from an occupier perspective, Josh, how have occupier needs evolved post-pandemic? And what do you think is driving that shift?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I think there are flashpoints and there are three major problems that occupiers are going through. I just want to talk about my favorite flashpoint, which I think everyone's going to think it's COVID, but actually it's WeWork. And, you know, the industry has changed so much since the introduction of WeWork and Adam Newman in terms of what that guy really tapped into, which was a real flexible style of working and a different approach to working. And what he's brought to, you know, the industry in terms of our industry and having to relook at how people work has been fascinating. And then COVID kind of comes around and it really pushes this hybrid agile style working to the forefront. But I think WeWork was really the start of, a lot of that conversation. I think if you were to look at occupiers right now, I think there are three major problems that really they haven't really nailed yet. I think one, the hybrid model itself. I think a lot of occupiers out there have not really nailed that properly. And I think there's a back and forth discussion. I think there are some occupiers that have done really, really well. I think that it's the larger ones that have a real kind of centralized approach to it, mandated from a global kind of position. Those guys seem to do very well, and there's a set, clear boundary. I think when you get more local or regional businesses, it's very difficult to kind of define hybrid and agile. I think the second major issue that we're having right now is the generational issue, right? We've got three generations that both look at work and define work very, very differently. You've got Gen Z coming through. You've got my generation, millennials or Gen Y. And then above me in that C-suite level, you've got Gen X, right? And they all view work very, very differently. You've got the Jamie Dimons of this world saying, look, would like to come back to work, that Gen X that kind of Gen X approach to things, get back to work. Work is where the culture is. I really appreciate that, you're driven a little bit differently, but, I'd really appreciate if you came back to work. Then you've got millennials and we're kind of looking up at that conversation and we're saying, I kind of get it and I'm with it, right? But then we're proverbially looking down at Gen Z and we're, who have a very different outlook on how they want to work, where they want to work and, and their approach to work. And we kind of think, okay, I kind of understand that right now as well. So we're kind of like stuck in the middle, kind of looking up and down and going, but get what you're saying and I get what you're saying. So I think that's the second biggest problem. And then the biggest one that we have right now is, and how can any business plan when you've got this much global uncertainty? And I thought, how can you plan month to month, year to year with this uncertainty? But now it looks like week to week with what's happened recently. And I think that's a real difficult thing for the workplace. How can you plan to engage and have discussions when you don't know where your business is going to be facing or what your business is going to be facing in a week's time? So, the priority there has shifted. And I think that's definitely one of the major issues. So flashpoints, COVID, WeWork, and then you've got the actual issues, which is hybrid, global uncertainty, and this generational mix that's happening in the workforce at the moment, and the conversations around that.
It's interesting, isn't it, when you bring WeWork to the fore? Because I do think most people would probably think of COVID as a major flashpoint. Are you seeing a higher demand for flexibility in office space needs, in leases?
I think so. I think right now flexibility is key. And I think being able to move with, the uncertainty with the market, if you can find a landlord that can do that effectively. And I know that landlords are keen to tap into that. They just, it's incredibly difficult. And I think Yongki can probably speak to it more than I could. Yeah. But if you can get a landlord to kind of tap into something a bit more flexible or look at maybe a deal structure that kind of it kind of moves. It's got a cap and a collar perhaps in terms of your rent, but it moves up and down in line with the market and the sentiment and the GDP. I mean, there's all ways that you could look at this and you've got to be a bit, think outside the box a little bit. But I think there is space for more flexibility within a lease term or leases, especially these traditional leases, which are 3 to 5 years or even longer. We need that flexibility. So I think that's where a priority is. I think it's really up to the landlords on how they drive that and what they can offer, because I think there are accounting standards and all sorts of things that, go beyond me and my understanding on how you kind of value a building, and Yongki can speak to that, but they will have accounting practices that they need to kind of look at, and that will be really, really difficult to kind of understand.
So from a landlord perspective, Yongki, how are landlords adapting to new expectations? Because in particular, when you think of Hong Kong, it's been a market that's worked in favor of landlords for a long, long time. And landlords must have to be really thinking outside the box now. Are developers sort of having to rethink the purpose of the office?
I don't think there's a short answer to that. I think if I could go back and talk about the sort of major recent trends, and I guess, like Josh said, COVID and the impact of that in hybrid flexible working is one thing. But another thing I think we should distinguish from the after effects of COVID is the fact that, like you've said, Andy, the market is in a current downturn that probably hasn't been seen in 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, certainly not in my lifetime because I'm a safe millennial. And so at one point, I think there has been a sea change in the way that the office is perceived. But that has always, and more so recently, been tempered by the fact that Hong Kong is a relatively unique jurisdiction when it comes to offices. I think Singapore is the analogy that comes to mind. And at the far end of the other far end of the spectrum would be sort of your London, New York, Sydney kind of thing. I think it's probably been said a million times that Hong Kong is not conducive to working from home, given that our commutes are very short, homes are very small and cramped. On the other hand, if I were to dig into my personal experience, I mean, I personally don't like working from home, partly because my partner works from home, but also because I suppose for me, I work in a very bricks and mortar kind of business, and much of my job requires me, or it's helpful to my job to be in the office. In direct ways, I have an inspection. I can't take that virtually, but also I do sound a bit old here, I think, but the water cooler effect, I don't know if we're still using that term.
Yeah.
I do genuinely believe in that. I don't really want to endorse Jamie Dimon, but I suppose we are aligned in that respect. I think the office market has changed dramatically. But we haven't seen this massive change that I think people often talk about. And perhaps WeWork is a good example, because you look at WeWork at its height, I don't know, the timeline 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
When SoftBank was investing billions, I mean, literally billions into it. And WeWork now, or the remnants of WeWork in Hong Kong, which are more or less pretty robust, staid businesses that are not hugely different from the co-working offices that, say, my dad would have worked in 10 years ago. And so I think Hong Kong, in many ways, changes faster than other jurisdictions. Our standard lease term is 3 years, whereas in the UK, it's traditionally been 10, 15, 20 years, although I understand that's changing recently. So we are dynamic, but in this respect, I think we're very traditional, very conservative.
And do you think the landlord's role has shifted more from space provider to experience enabler?
It's a good question. I think this is why it's important to distinguish between the impact of COVID and the downturn of the market. I like to think that it's more the latter that's causing landlords to think, be proactive. And I don't want to sound too cynical, but at a certain point, it's stepping away from such a market dominant position for so long, where many people who are older than I am have only ever experienced a market where landlords could quite literally often just dictate what tenants should do and what they should pay. And it doesn't benefit me personally, but that's probably not the healthiest way to operate a landlord and tenant market. And so in that way, there is an increased dynamism, there is an increased recognition from most landlords, or at least I think landlords who will survive, that you have to be more proactive. You have to understand that things have changed. So yes, in a short answer, yes.
And do you think that's driven a lot by the contraction of space requirements, where a tenant might have required a larger space, they're now working more hybrid or using flexible desking, etc., and then passing on the cultural experience side and expectation of that to the landlord? If I take Taiku, for example, it's a campus.
I think what I'm starting to see now is a lot more emphasis is being put on the landlord to offer a more diverse amount of, products and amenities. I mean, let's take legal firms, right? There are some fantastic legal firms in Taiku Place. Per fee earner, we did some work. Per fee earner 3 years ago, that was about 570 square foot per fee earner for for a law firm. That's how much space they needed. That is drastically reduced to about 470, right? And the reason for that is, and I think really the driving force to getting down to Taikoo, in 2022 or before that was, look, we're going to be moving, down the island to Island East. But in return, we're giving you a much nicer, bigger, more beautiful space, floor to ceiling windows, amazing views of the harbor. You're going to have, being probably the best asset in Hong Kong, One Taikoo Place. It's a fantastic building. But, push has come to shove. We're now we're in a place where actually we kind of need to tighten up the balance sheet. So we don't need a canteen, right? So I know a law firm that kind of gave away their space, which was primarily a canteen, or we just needed to tighten up the belt. And so the space per fee earner has gone down. But what I'm trying to get at is, they have such a fantastic portfolio down there. They've got 1880, right, which is an amazing clubhouse. They've got fantastic amenities, and they've just kind of taken on that role even more. And I think that's great. And I think that's exactly what landlords need to do. They need to they need to think more creatively. And that was always what Swire wanted to do in it anyway. But they've really taken it, and they've got, they've linked up that whole development now, One Taikoo, to One Island East, to Two Taikoo Place, and it's more integrated. So the need
taking what WeWork did on a small scale or on a floor of a building and putting it into a whole development.
Just giving you all of those amenities. Throughout the portfolio. So I think, there is definitely occupiers driving. There is a driving force there that says, we're going to put the emphasis now on the landlord to offer the products that we want. We're not going to integrate them into our space, but you're going to give us the development that we want. And I think there is the best, and then there is the rest when it comes to landlords in that sense. If a landlord doesn't want to look at creating an asset and integrating the asset properly and creating the right ecosystem, then they're going to be falling lower down in the rental kind of chain. I think those landlords that really look at their space, look at the asset, the Swires of this world, etc., those are the guys that can, I know it's a difficult market, but can still drive a decent dollar value here.
Interesting.
If I could just jump in, the main reason for, I think, the difficulty, from what I can tell, and it's just my view, is that there's always been a lack of supply in Hong Kong of offices and, pretty robust demand. But now that demand obviously has fallen, and really, quite unfortunately, the supply has all come online in the last year or 2, 3 years, and more will come in the next couple of years. So obviously there's a very large lag between the demand being noticed and the asset being built. This is, I promise, a random example, but I think One Causeway Bay is a really good one in terms of, the Excelsior was knocked down because it didn't have much use as a hotel, beloved as it was. And it was built as an office tower, which 5-10 years ago was, nobody can blame anyone for making that decision. And nobody can predict the future. And we see now that was, unfortunately, not the right choice. And then, slightly lesser extent is the fact that companies are going hybrid. An example I like to use is pharmaceutical companies in Hong Kong. All but 2 of the major pharmaceutical occupiers in Hong Kong have pretty much a full hybrid, as in staff can work from home every day, with the exception of maybe 2-3 times a month when they are semi-required to come into the office for a town hall or something of the like. But at the end of the day, it falls on the employer, or more specifically, the manager of that office, their discretion as to whether he or she wants their staff in the office or not. And I think ultimately, from what I can see, you cannot change the inherent Hong Kong conditions that are not conducive to working from home.
Yeah, it's funny. It's the lessons you learn from around the world. And I was in the UK during the pandemic, and I think everybody thought that hybrid working was here to stay. And there was a report done, I think it was by one of the big 4 in the UK, and it looked at the impact of home working on productivity and its impact on UK GDP. And they thought it was 15 billion in loss of GDP as a result of home working. So yeah, it's you can see that really driving in the other direction now in the UK.
I've always gone by this quote when it comes to working from home. You can work from home, but you cannot build a career from home. Right? How do you like that?
Oh.
And I think that's the reality.
Yeah.
And I think it really is. If you, especially when we're, like I say, when we're dealing with, Gen X in that C-suite, we need to be seen, especially in Hong Kong. It's a kind of very different working culture.
Yeah.
If you're not seen in the office, it's where is so-and-so. To that point, you cannot build a career from
I
working
completely
from home.
agree. Yeah, I completely agree. So good segue into the subject of placemaking, talking about the portfolio you've got down at Taikoo Yongki. What does placemaking mean in a commercial context, and how does Taikoo reflect this new vision?
I mean, I knew this question was coming, but it's a tough one. I think placemaking is pretty difficult to pin down, but if I could have an attempt, the way we look at it in Taikoo Place or in Swire Properties as a whole is that sense of community. It's that holistic portfolio. And in many ways, we're very fortunate to have this site that we have in Taikoo Place, which many people may not know used to be the sugar refinery for Swire back in the 1850s and 60s, 19th century, don't quote me on that, with Taikoo Shing, the residential being the dockyards. And so that means that we have consolidated control, and we have private roads, which I know sounds trivial, but it makes a huge difference in terms of what we can do under the umbrella of placemaking is our annual Christmas Street Fair, as well as our Tongchong Street Market. And that's a really good example of how that sort of holistic approach to how we manage the portfolio really comes out. We have the ability to close off that whole street. We have the ability to corral our various F&B operators, our tenants who may be quasi-retail in the office portfolio to come and just have that sense of community. Beyond that, I mean, I'd be more comfortable defining it by its specific examples.
Is there a shift from a tenant perspective to more sort of concierge hospitality type services?
First, I think Taikoo Place is obviously a very large portfolio, but it is still just one portfolio in a pretty large market. And obviously we cater to a relatively specific niche of companies, usually larger entities, usually multinationals, not to say that we're limited to them. From what I can see anecdotally, I think that it's one of two things, and this applies to sustainability as well, which I think we'll get onto. One is attracting staff, especially younger staff, and two is putting that vision or approach forward for your clients. So obviously, your LVMH will look at it differently from your Simmons & Simmons. It really depends on how that company chooses to express what is important to them or not. I don't think that there are many companies out there who are putting on their website saying, slash and burn, baby, we don't care about the trees or the environment. But at the end of the day, it's about prioritization. And it's horses for courses, I think. If I used to work in Pacific Place and I had 800 square foot tenants in 2 Pacific Place. To go to them and say, hey, do you want to engage with us on ABC? It just doesn't make practical sense. So I think it just depends on the circumstances.
And from an office experience perspective, Josh, do you see occupiers shifting focus to workplace experience and employee well-being?
I think what I'm about to say is probably a bit controversial, but I think we're not having those conversations right now. And there is just so much global uncertainty. And I think there is a real push for the bottom line. How much can you reduce my rent? Am I getting the right space? We're not talking about talent retention. We're not talking about how to activate the space or the employee experience. We kind of are, but not as much as we should be. Nowhere near as much as we should be. And we should be having those conversations. And I think it's no one's fault. It is the situation that we are in. It's not that, businesses are avoiding it. They're not avoiding it. They just, they can't prioritize it right now because they have so much more baggage to look at right now. I think just as an example, right? If you look at anywhere in Hong Kong since, I guess Hong Kong rents have dropped 40% since 2019. So you've got 2 lease cycles there, right? And in one lease cycle, you've got a 20% reduction. In Hong Kong, which was a booming market, you've got a 20% reduction. As a CFO, COO, going to the board and just saying, hey guys, I've just got us this. You look like a rock star, right? The other part of that conversation is, well, let's look at our space. Let's look at what we can do. Let's look at maybe a potential relocation here, activating the space. Are we in the right building? No, that conversation kind of goes away, right? Then you come back up to another lease term. You've got another 15-20% reduction. Again, you look like a rock star, right? And rightfully so, right? And so this kind of economic uncertainty, the markets don't predicate for that right now in terms of let's look at the employee experience, because I think there is a conversation there that needs to be had.
Yeah.
Absolutely. With that, like I say, with different generations coming through the business, different expectations, we need to be engaging the workforce, and we need to be engaging every stakeholder through that business and understanding what they want. Because I think you'll end up finding, well, we can collaborate more, we can get more productivity in the space. And you start to see the needle move slightly. And I think that's really what companies want at the end of the day.
It's interesting when you think back to kind of 2015 to 2019, where I actually believe globally office design was so optimized towards the employee, and it was all about retention, attraction of staff. Moving into COVID, how things changed, and how we've emerged out of that period with the need still being subliminally there to create culture through the office space that's adopted. But actually the shift has gone from, well, we need smaller offices because our CapEx wise, we don't want the outlay, but we're going to pass part of that development of culture onto the landlord in terms of the estate that's created around the office. I wonder, because a lot of these things become the norm after time shifts, and I wonder if that will become, be something that moving forward landlords just have to incorporate into their real estate portfolios.
I think it is. I think I might forget what the name. It's Bishopgate in London. I remember seeing that pre-COVID, seeing the specs of that building and what they were doing in terms of their F&B, doing in terms of activating certain floors, and I was just blown away. And I just think that's where buildings need to be headed. And if you look around the corner at Taikoo Place, they're doing that already, right? Yeah. But just the landlord kind of taking more, I guess, more of a position on it, and saying, look, this is what we want to do for our tenants. And I think they kind of need to look at that in Hong Kong a little bit more.
Interesting.
Now, a more central landlord, I think they've kind of probably lent on the fact that we're in central and everyone wants to be in central. And it's such a busy area. So they're kind of, I'm not saying that they are innovating, but I mean, you've got things like Site 3 coming up now, Henderson's new project. That looks unbelievable. That's going to create new retail clusters for Central. So I think projects like that are exactly what Central need. And it's going to redefine those retail clusters. I just think, if you're a landlord in Central, maybe the need to innovate wasn't necessarily there because they just had that location and locality, and they actually had a really great product to start with anyway, right? But tenants' needs have changed.
Is ESG driving decisions yet, or is it kind of still lip service?
I'm going to let you answer that one, Yongki.
I saw that coming. If I could be a bit pedantic, or maybe it's not, ESG, I've always found that a bit troubling. I mean, because it's 3 in 1. Can we, for present purposes, just talk about the E?
Yeah.
Sorry, what was the question that Josh so artfully dodged? To repeat, please.
I will answer it, but I think it's a landlord.
Of course.
Is ESG driving decisions yet, or is it still in that kind of lip service phase? And if I can, take it from our world, it definitely was a tick box exercise maybe 6 years ago. Then we hit COVID. I think there was lots of climate anxiety that developed off the back of people coming out of COVID.
Yep.
I think people saw dolphins swimming up the canals in Venice, and for the first time, people in Beijing saw there was mountains nearby. And I do believe that now it's not just a tick box exercise in terms of fit out and the requirements of what we have to do as supply chain partners to tenants moving into a landlord space. But I'm interested purely from a landlord perspective. Do you see ESG driving decisions?
Put it this way, if every occupier was 20% like JEB Group, we'd save the world tomorrow. But unfortunately, we're not in that position. I think that very few, if any, people will say we don't care about environmental issues, sustainability. I think I alluded to it earlier, it's whether you're willing to put your money where your mouth is. And if you take that to a literal extent, it's very rare, although not impossible, to find a tenant who will pay more, even if it's $1 more, to do the right thing, as opposed to the cheaper thing. And I think reinstatement is a really good example of that. But I don't want to sort of go on too much about this, but we in Swire Properties, we have what we call the Green Performance Pledge, which is sort of a partnership we have as a landlord with tenants. And that's been really, really well received. I think sustainability in the commercial office space is two things. The first of which many people are doing really well, which is building the greenest possible building. And so the obvious way of measuring that is saying, oh, we've got LEED Platinum, we've got we've got Beam Plus. I can't really keep track of them, but they are important international recognitions. But say 2 Taikoo Place or 6 Pacific Place, which are our newest buildings, and triple platinum, whatever, they're still older than the Henderson. They're still older than IGC. They're still older than LG8. It's an inevitable fact of life. I mean, Hong Kong Land's portfolio is a great example, and I think Josh mentioned it. It's an older portfolio, but what Hong Kong Land has done and has been doing to retroactively refit, improve, upgrade their assets, it's astounding. It's incredible. You would not know that they're 60, 70-year-old buildings. And so that's sort of having the 4 walls. What we have tried to do more of, that we have found tenants to be receptive to, is engaging tenants once they move into that box. And it's more concrete things, and I think it bleeds quite well into engaging your staff and engaging on sort of a mass level with your company to say, okay, you do need to recycle more. You do need to think more about how much water you're using, how much energy you're using. And it's little behavioral change things that, I certainly have picked up in the last few years sort of driving this project, which is, it more often than not does take more effort. The ever ubiquitous plastic lunchbox in Hong Kong, bring your own. And it's so difficult to get this mindset across. If you have a plastic coffee cup, wash it, rinse it, dry it, put it in the recycling. It sounds so simple, but you're having a really crap day. You just so tired. You just don't have time for it. It's one of those things that is really, really challenging. And it's that on any extent of scale. It can be very large, can be very small, but it's that micro behavior that I think we need to influence. So we are just a venue for people to try to do better, I suppose. Same at home, same on the street, whatever it is, right?
In most part, what Yongki says completely true. I think what we tend to find is, obviously, I think the Western world, I think, looking at parts of Europe, they've taken huge strides in this. And I think if you were to look at, so when we get RFPs, right, requests for proposals for a large project, and it's driven outside of Hong Kong, there is a massive ESG piece into that. The RFP probably comes internally from Hong Kong. The SG piece is there, but it's not a big of a statement. And I think that's really conducive. I think Hong Kong it is going that way. We are still a couple of years away from where it needs to be. I think landlords like Swire are very smart with this, the green performance pledge. What they're doing is they're getting in front of the conversation of a green lease, right? Leases at the moment very much fall on landlord's terms here. I think they're very landlord friendly. And I think a green lease introduced into this market kind of takes that power away. So a lot of the landlords here, they're coming and they need to be proactive and they need to be seen like they're doing things. One, because actually a lot of companies now will, even if it is being run regionally, can't be able to be seen to be moving into a building without LEED or Platinum, Beam, or any of those certifications. So there's that. But I think this green lease, that probably has the potential now to grow, and it takes a little bit of power away from the landlords. And I think that's something I think landlords will be keeping an eye on. And I think, but I still think things like the green performance pledge are fantastic, and that they're really, really quite strong indicators from Swire that they take this very, very seriously, and that's what we need to do.
Again, it's coming back to a lot of the landlords picking up the legwork in order to drive differentiation, but also to help the tenant to complete their goals.
Yeah.
From an ESG perspective. Do you think green leases can create accountability? And, Swire are a prime example of a landlord who's leading the way in from an ESG perspective. I've always thought that large corporations can drive their morals, their goals down through their supply chain. And, you see that time and time again. Green leases are definitely that opportunity for a landlord to drive your goals through your tenants. Yeah. Keen to hear your thoughts on that and how you think they can maybe create a bit of accountability.
Yeah.
Major impacts are customer moving in to that space and the fit out, but exiting the space as well.
I think it's important to sort of drill down a bit on green leases. I think it's a term that is used a lot, but I would use it loosely. I mean, we do have a few tenants that have signed green leases to a certain extent, but none that have done what I would, well, not me, but what, as I understand, the market would generally classify as the darker green leases. So it's when the carrot and or stick really comes into play. For example, the tenant commits to having a water use intensity below X. If the tenant exceeds that intensity, then they have to pay additional management charges. I'm making this up. Or if the landlord is unable to adhere to a promise, then they have to discount something or give them a freebie. And I understand, say in the UK, that there are leases that have these real punchy provisions. I think a major part is that, not in this market, always it's going to be, let's get the deal across the line. And so it will, I think, for the foreseeable future, be on a more voluntary basis. But, I've had personally some really good feedback from tenants with whom I've signed green leases who say, sometimes I've got a corporate HQ requirement. And they said, I need to have ABCD. But it's based in, it's from a document that's from HQ in Germany, or it's in France, or whatever it is. And so it doesn't really apply. And so I've had some good feedback when I said to a tenant, look, I can tick all your boxes, and here you go. And so in a way that does help tenants. And it's not saving the earth, but that is important, I think, because people are just, they do need to go through the motions, right? It's an important process. But also, I think tenants, even larger companies, don't have the skills, don't have the time, don't have the wherewithal to really do more on sustainability, despite the fact that there's increasing pressure on them to do better. So one really rather extreme example was when a French bank came to me and said, our HQ has told us we need to reduce carbon emissions in our office by 20% in the next 5 years. And the person who's the head of administration said, I have no idea how to do this. And I said, neither do I. But thankfully, we have, I think what does set us apart, Swire Properties, on sustainability is that we have a dedicated team that is full of what I call the climate nerds, people who are genuinely passionate, people who are genuinely knowledgeable in this field, who are the backbone of what we do on engagement. I implement. And these really clever people come up with all of these things. And, it's not rocket science to a certain extent, but you can address all of these questions. I was talking to a law firm recently, and the head of corporate real estate came in from the UK, and he said, we really need to look at scope 3 emissions. Last year I would have been like, what's a scope 3? And now I can say, well, I can't help you explicitly, but I can tell you what we as your landlord are doing to, mitigate blah, blah, blah. And so we can have that conversation.
That's massive progress, though.
Yeah. So, I have to plug it, but, we were ranked first in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index this year or last year, which means that we hit our sort of targets many, many years early. And I'm told that we're going to hit our net zero targets, hopefully by 2050.
Wow.
And so there's a lot of stuff going on in the background. I am one cog, and I don't say this in a too demeaning a way, but I'm one small cog in a very large machine of people. And I think it really matters that senior management, Swire Properties, genuinely really wants to do the right thing in this space.
On the subject of leases, what do you think the future of leases are? And are long leases still relevant?
I'll take a stab at this, but I kind of alluded to it earlier. I think more flexibility in leases is really, really needed. And I'm not saying, look, we can leave anytime we want. I'm not saying that. But we need to think a bit more creatively and think a bit more outside of the box in terms of the space that we're in, how we effectively use that space, and how we effectively price that space. And I think there is a real shift change. And I think that will be any landlord that can actually nail that and say, and look like we're working with a tenant within, a certain bandwidth. Your rent can go up, it can go down. We've got a cap and a collar here. Be interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, let's shake it up.
Yeah.
I'm desperate to see, some forward thinking in that kind of space. And, and I think tenants would take to that really, really well. Really well. And I think, it just shows that there is that relationship between tenant and landlord, between the two and working around that. So I think for me, flexibility, you kind of just given the world that we're in right now, give it a go. Why not? Throw the kitchen sink at it and see what we can do.
I think it's a push and pull. I think it's a symptom of the market. When the market is very landlord friendly, as it has been for many years, the landlord can dictate. And the norm, if I have to take sort of an average, is usually 6 years, maybe 9 years for very large occupiers with a rent review after 3 years. That's been the norm. And increasingly now we have tenants saying, actually, I want to have a 5 years fixed. 5 years ago, we would never have, most landlords would have said, no, thank you, we're not doing that. And they were in a position to do that.
Because somebody was lining up behind to take that space, yeah.
I wouldn't know. I joined the landlord in the height of COVID, so that's me. And so I think it's a functioning of the market, right? It's that fundamentally, I see the landlord and tenant relationship as a push and pull of certainty or the mitigation of risk. For us to have security of income as a landlord for a longer period of time at a fixed rent, obviously, is very good. But tenants want more flexibility. Tenants want that surrender right. They want to say, well, actually, after 12 months, I want to be able to give it up. And oh, by the way, I want you to waive reinstatement as well. I say, well, what about my firstborn child? Or, do you want the clothes off my back? So it's a sign of the times. But Hong Kong has always been, I think, a pretty dynamic place. In a past life, before I joined Swire Properties, I worked in a consultancy advising, among other things, on rent reviews. And I got sort of my real estate degree in the UK, and everything I'd learned in that course sort of thrown out the window in Hong Kong, when it's like, oh, actually, no, we don't do that. It's way faster. Or, oh, no, that's not how it works. So I do think it's more exciting. But certainly there needs to be and is a change happening in the way that landlords approach it, because it's been stagnant, right? It's become it's not tenable.
It does become concerning from a sustainability perspective, when you consider 80% globally of office furniture and fit out ends up in landfill, probably closer to 95% in Hong Kong. If you create flexibility in these kind of, becomes almost like fast fashion, take a space, fit it out, even faster, it reaches the end of its life, and new tenant comes in, new fit out. Of course, for from a sustainability perspective, that's concerning. But I know in the UK, we're seeing a lot of landlords moving into that landlord fitted space, where the landlord is actually managing that fit out and extending the life of the product. Do you think that's something that you can see emerging here?
I really, really wish it will or will continue to do so. I think, for example, in Australia, in Sydney, Melbourne, it's a very sophisticated market in terms of the pre-fitted, whatever you want to call it, because the average vacancy has been 15-20% or something like that, whereas the average vacancy for grade A assets in Hong Kong has been less than 10%. And so it's that shift in mindset. But maybe if I put it this way, I don't know what the number is, but my gut feeling is the rate of, say, first-hand car purchases, and Andy, actually, I think we may have talked about this, versus second-hand car purchases in Hong Kong, compared to, say, the OECD as a whole, I'm sure Hong Kong will have a strong, strong preference for brand new. And so it's this mentality that is quite difficult to shake. When, if you're a 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 square foot occupier, experience tells me that 99% of the time, their office requirements are the same. You want an open plan area, you want ABC number of desks, you want this number of chairs, you want maybe a couple meeting rooms, maybe a small wet pantry. But every occupier comes in and says, now, I want this. And it's maybe incrementally different, but it's the same thing. And so it breaks my heart every time, because, nowadays less so because CapEx is so dear. But, when I was in Pacific Place 2.5 years ago, there were still cases of tenants, and we did do our best to try to prevent this, but tenants who would go or fit out and then use it for 6 years, sometimes even 3 years, strip it shell, and then fit it out again, often in a very similar way. And there is a better way. There must be a better way. But at the end of the day, I am not going to say, don't do this deal, or do take this lower rent. I'd be out of a job very quickly.
Yeah, and it's the push and pull factor that you were talking about earlier. But I do think in our roles, 39% of greenhouse gas emissions come from our sector, and in particular, it's the switching of space, the churn of space that creates those emissions. We definitely, in our careers, of the amount of clients that we deal with on a 3-year cycle, can make a massive impact.
Who globally, who's leading, I guess, best practice in that space?
I definitely think Europe is driving a lot of change in that respect. I think landlords such as Grosvenor, Portman Estates in London have evolved their estates, both from a ESG perspective and the impact on extended life cycle of spaces, but also have created a product as a result. So, they still have office leasing in the traditional sense, but the pressure on businesses in the UK is as great as it is anywhere else from a capex perspective.
So my next question is, what do you think? You've been here now, I guess, 6 to 8 months now?
8 months, yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Wow, really?
So what are the barriers? What are the barriers here that you're finding? Because I know you work in that space quite heavily. What are you finding that, what can they do in Europe quite easily that there's not coming over here? What's the disconnect?
I think it's just the fear of will it work? And, I think the drivers have to maybe be reviewed. In the UK, they're seeing quite large uplifts in pound per square foot for tenancy coming into spaces fitted. Potentially that's not going to be possible here, but the impact is maybe reduced voids and faster leasing of space.
Well, I think if you maybe if there was like a regulatory kind of piece out there that the government run where you haven't fully amortized your fit out, right? Then there's penalties associated with that, right?
And that's where green leases can come in and be so effective and drive those shared values into the tenant population. There's a lot of green finance, trillions of dollars of green finance available around the world that companies are trying to access, and enabling companies to access through their lease. In a green building, is huge for some occupiers. Not to mention how it can impact their journey towards net zero as an organization. From a final takeaway perspective, what's one key thing that you think facilities managers, developers, occupiers should focus on over the next 5 years? I know that's probably quite hard with everything we've unpacked across.
For me, I think it is very much adaptability and innovation is a conversation that needs to happen all across the business. And we've talked about how the landlord has really taken on a lot of those kind of, I guess that space. And I think the tenant has pushed it, but we still need tenants out there to drive that conversation. It's really, really important we do that. And that's conversations about the space that we're in, the space that we're using, the employee, the employee satisfaction within the space and the interaction. And we need to have conversations consistently about that. We need to be asking questions all the time. You're not always going to get it right, but you need to kind of keep that conversation flowing. And I think once you have that growing and you have that kind of environment, then actually the conversations with the landlords become incredibly productive, and they can really nail that piece as well. And you get to be in the asset that you've always wanted to be in. But if you stop having those conversations and we just keep talking about rent and we keep talking about how to optimize my space in terms of how much do I need to cut or expand, then it's going to be a really one-dimensional conversation.
Yeah.
You sound frustrated, Josh.
I'm not frustrated. I'm not. It's just, and it's like I said before, it's no one's fault.
It could be different though. It could be different.
I think, it's no one's fault. We're just in this space where we can't plan and we can't have these types of conversations right now. But I think if we really took a really good effort at it, I think we would be in a really much better space.
Yeah.
Look, I had what I thought was a really pithy and good answer ready for this, but it's totally slipped my mind. I guess what I'll say is, and I guess I'm piggybacking on what Josh has said, but from a landlord perspective, from a selfish perspective, I find that it's so tempting to apply this overarching easy formula to say, okay, that's it. This is what we need to address. This is what we're doing. But unfortunately, it never is that way. one of my favorite parts of the job is that I get to talk to tenants, and strangers really tell me about their lives, their businesses, and it's endlessly fascinating. Goodness knows I've learned a lot about different industries that I didn't even know existed. And I think the takeaway from me is that almost every occupier needs the same thing. They need space for butts on seats, for people to make money for them at the end of the day. But it's the nuances between them that I think makes it really exciting, because every different occupier has a slightly different need. And after a while, I'm not that old, I've not been doing it for that long, but there is a pattern, and people just have their needs. And it's sort of, my old boss in consultancy used to say, don't go to people saying that you're the bee's knees, go to them having identified their problem and telling them how you're going to solve it. And I think that's really the only reliable way to approach the leasing market now. And try not to cry too much, basically.
Lots of crying.
Lots
Lots of
screaming
crying.
into the void.
Screaming into the abyss.
You came into this room laughing.
Yeah. No, it's not too bad. It's okay.
We carry on.
We carry on, yeah. We just keep going.
Well, thank you guys. Thanks a million. That's a wrap for today's episode of JEBCast. A big thank you to Josh and Yongki for sharing their insights on the evolving landscape of the future of leasing. If you've enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to follow JEBCast on your favorite podcast platform and share it with your network, especially anyone navigating the challenges or workplace strategy, design, or sustainability. We'll be back soon with more conversations that redefine how office design works, is built, and how we thrive in places we work. Until next time, I'm Andy Russell, and thanks for listening.